Callum, Steele, Morven Declan, Crow, Kavanagh, and Imelda Roach weren't just names whispered in the backrooms of pubs. They were the architects of a cross-border empire that smuggled guns, drugs, and death between London and Dublin. Together, they built an alliance so powerful it rewrote the rules of the underworld until betrayal, blood, and a war they couldn't control turned them from partners into each other's most dangerous enemies. London in the early 2000s was a city buzzing with opportunity for those willing to take risks. But in the shadows, the streets were ruled by men who valued fear over fortune. Callum Steele Morven was one of them, a man whose name alone made debtors pay early and rivals think twice before crossing him. He wasn't just another street-level hustler. Steele had a mind built for strategy. Where others fought over street corners, he looked at ports, freight routes, and international connections. He saw crime as a business that could be scaled, and his ambition was far bigger than any East End turf war. Steele's rise began when he noticed a flaw in the system. Border checks between the UK and Ireland were loose for certain types of cargo. Most criminals saw Ireland as a small market, not worth the risk of moving goods across the water. But Steele saw something different: a gateway. The Irish Sea wasn't a barrier, it was a bridge to new markets, new allies, and an underworld no London crew had fully tapped into. All he needed was the right partner. That partner came in the form of Imelda Roach, a smuggler from Cork whose operations were as sharp as her instincts. She didn't run her business like a back-alley trade. She ran it like a multinational company with layers of protection between her and the goods. Her network moved contraband hidden inside shipments of food, electronics, even livestock. Imelda was known for being untouchable. Police had been after her for years, but never managed to make charges stick. When Steele heard about her, he knew she was the missing piece in his grand design. Their first meeting was arranged through a mutual contact on the London docks. Imelda wasn't impressed by the young East Londoner at first, but Steele had something she valued: vision. He laid out his plan for a smuggling route that would be invisible to customs, using legitimate import-export companies as cover. Every shipment would look clean on paper, but inside, hidden compartments would carry drugs, guns, and anything else the market demanded. The risk was enormous, but the profits could change the game forever. Imelda agreed, not because she trusted him, but because she recognized ambition when she saw it. The operation started small. One container, one shipment. It arrived without incident. The second shipment was bigger, and again it slid through without raising suspicion. Soon the profits began to grow, and so did the complexity of their network. Dock workers were paid to look the other way. Truck drivers were carefully chosen for their silence, and even mid-level customs officers were fed small bribes to keep the system blind. Steele and Imelda didn't just build a route, they built a fortress of deception. It wasn't long before Steele set his sights on Dublin. He had heard whispers about a man there named Declan Crow. Kavanagh, a figure who inspired both respect and dread. Crow wasn't loud or flashy. He didn't need to be. His legend was built on precision. Every target he was hired to remove disappeared without a trace, and every job was done so cleanly that the police could never pin him down. Crow ran parts of Dublin like a chessboard, moving his pieces in silence, striking only when the odds were in his favor. Steele knew that if he could win Crow's trust, the smuggling routes would be untouchable. Imelda made the introduction, though even she warned that Crow didn't work with outsiders easily. The meeting was brief but enough for Crow to see that Steele wasn't a reckless gangster chasing quick money. He was calculating, patient, and willing to invest in infrastructure most criminals ignored. By the end of that winter, the three had struck an unspoken understanding. Dublin would handle distribution in Ireland, London would handle the UK, and the Irish Sea would be their private highway. Their alliance didn't just make money. It changed the underworld. Rivals who once battled over local deals now found themselves pushed out entirely, unable to compete with the speed, quality, and security of Steele and Imelda's operation. Drugs that once trickled into Ireland now flowed in like a tide, and weapons meant for war zones were suddenly showing up in the hands of street gangs. The police knew something was happening, but the network was too deep, too well protected, and too international for a quick takedown. By the end of the first year, Steele's name was known in Dublin as much as in London. Crow's influence ensured no one dared touch their shipments, and Imelda's logistics kept everything invisible. What started as an idea in the mind of an ambitious East Londoner had become a cross-border empire, one that no one could stop without spilling blood on both sides of the sea. The turning point in the empire's rise came on a storm-lashed night in Dublin's docklands. Rain pounded the rusted rooftops of warehouses, the wind cutting through the air like blades. A container shipment worth millions in drugs and weapons was due to arrive, hidden deep within crates of machine parts. It was the kind of delivery that could finance the network for months. But when the cargo ship finally docked, the container was gone. At first, Callum Steele Morvan thought it might be a custom sweep or a lucky police tip-off. He wasn't panicked. His routes were usually airtight. But Declan Kavanagh had seen enough to know this wasn't the work of law enforcement. The container had been lifted with precision, the kind of theft that could only come from another crew with inside knowledge. Crow had heard whispers of a Belfast gang making moves into Dublin territory, testing boundaries, looking for weaknesses. This was more than theft. It was a direct challenge to their power. The loss was devastating. The stolen goods weren't just worth millions, they represented months of careful planning and risk. Crow, known for his calculated approach, didn't waste time with negotiations or warnings. He summoned Noel, Red Hand. Baron, a man whose reputation for violence was whispered in back alleys and prison yards alike. Red Hand wasn't just a hitman. He was a message, a walking embodiment of what happened when you crossed the wrong people. 2 days later, the leader of the Belfast crew was found in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The scene was so brutal that even seasoned police officers struggled to process it. There were no fingerprints, no cameras, no witnesses, only a blood-soaked warning carved into the wooden floor with a blade. In the underworld, the meaning was clear: the network could not be touched without consequence. That killing wasn't an isolated act of vengeance. It was the first step in what would later be known as the Blood Agreement. Steele and Crow formalized their alliance that week, with Imelda Roche overseeing the logistics to ensure no supply line could be intercepted again. The pact was simple but absolute. They would protect each other's territory, share intelligence, and combine their resources to crush any rival. If one was attacked, both would respond. The Blood Agreement changed everything. With London and Dublin united under one network, the smuggling routes became faster and more secure. Shipments moved in greater quantities, hidden under increasingly sophisticated covers. Steele expanded operations into Liverpool, using the port as a staging ground for goods heading to Ireland. Crow, meanwhile, tightened his grip on Dublin, removing small-time dealers and replacing them with loyal enforcers who answered only to him. The profits soared, but so did the attention. Rival crews began to either submit to the alliance or vanish entirely. Some chose exile, fleeing to Spain or Eastern Europe, while others were quietly removed. The expansion reached beyond drugs and weapons. Soon, stolen luxury cars, counterfeit cash, and even rare art pieces were moving along the same routes. Imelda's logistical genius kept the operation invisible, her network of corrupt officials and dock workers ensuring that containers sailed through inspections without delay. But with the growing power came a darker undercurrent. The pact had created something more dangerous than either Steele or Crow had anticipated. Violence became sharper, more calculated. When a small-time smuggler in Cork refused to pay his share, His business was burned to the ground in broad daylight. The ashes still warm when the police arrived. In London, a warehouse suspected of holding rival merchandise mysteriously caught fire during the night, the blaze visible for miles. The blood agreement wasn't just a business deal. It was a silent declaration of war against anyone who stood in their way. And the longer it lasted, the more it transformed the criminal landscape on both sides of the Irish Sea. By the end of that year, the alliance had reached as far as Spain's Costa del Sol, where British and Irish gangsters often hid from police scrutiny. From there, weapons from Eastern Europe were funneled into the UK and Ireland, while cocaine shipments from South America flowed back through. The network was no longer a local enterprise. It had become an international syndicate with the resources of a small army. Police forces on both sides of the water knew they were facing something unprecedented. Intelligence reports spoke of encrypted communications, shell companies, and millions in untraceable offshore accounts. But with every new piece of information, the alliance stayed one step ahead, adjusting routes, changing codes, and moving assets before the authorities could act. The blood agreement had started as a pact for mutual protection, but it quickly evolved into something much more. A criminal empire so efficient, it was as if it had been designed for war. And as the violence escalated, even Steele began to wonder how far Crow would go to keep their power intact. Ethan, Hound, Caro had always been the quiet backbone of the operation. He didn't seek glory or recognition, but without him, the network's most critical shipments would have never made it through. Hound was a specialist in moving cargo under the radar, a courier who could vanish from cameras, leave no electronic footprint, and bypass every layer of scrutiny. He had the uncanny ability to disappear into the background, blending in with truckers, dock workers, or fishermen, depending on the route. For years, his work went unnoticed by anyone outside the inner circle, and that was exactly how he liked it. In the spring of 2009, Hound was tasked with a routine run from Liverpool to Cork. The shipment was typical: arms and narcotics hidden inside crates of imported agricultural machinery. The job had been planned with precision, every step mapped out. He was to leave Liverpool before dawn, drive through the port security under the guise of a legitimate hauler, take the ferry across the Irish Sea, and deliver the cargo to a discreet warehouse outside Cork. For Hound, this was just another day on the job. But somewhere along that journey, he vanished. The truck never made it to the warehouse. It was found 3 days later, parked on a narrow rural road in County Kerry, its back doors wide open, the cargo gone. The inside of the trailer was empty except for a single black feather lying on the floor, as if left deliberately. The locals who saw the abandoned vehicle claimed it had been there since the night of a heavy storm, but no one could remember seeing the driver. When news of the disappearance reached Callum, Steele, Morven and Declan, Crow, Kavanagh, panic turned quickly to suspicion. Steele had worked with Hound for years and trusted him implicitly, but Crow wasn't as certain. To him, loyalty was only as strong as the money behind it. The missing cargo was worth millions, and its loss was more than just financial. It was a direct threat to the network's reliability. If their enemies learned that one of their top couriers could be intercepted, it would invite attacks on every route they controlled. Theories began to circulate in the underworld. Some said Hound had been ambushed by a rival crew and killed, his body dumped in the sea. Others believed he had stolen the cargo himself and fled the country, perhaps starting a new life somewhere far away with a fortune in contraband. A few, mostly those with connections to intelligence agencies, suggested a darker possibility: that Hound had been working as an informant for months, gathering evidence and feeding it to the police or even an international task force. Imelda Roch took the loss personally. Hound's disappearance wasn't just a business setback, it was a stain on her logistical empire. She ordered her network to sweep through every port, warehouse, and known smuggling route for signs of him or the missing cargo. In the weeks that followed, 3 members of a small time cork gang were found dead, each killed in ways that sent a clear message. Whether or not they had anything to do with Hound's vanishing didn't matter. The killings were meant to remind everyone that crossing the network carried a death sentence. Steele, however, noticed something that kept him awake at night. The black feather found in the truck matched the calling card of a small but ruthless crew in Northern Ireland who had been quietly making moves in recent months. They were known for silent hits and symbolic warnings, and their leader had a history with Crow, an old feud from years before. Steele began to suspect that the disappearance wasn't random, but rather a calculated strike designed to undermine the blood agreement from the inside. The more Steele investigated, the more uneasy he became. Certain details about the route had only been shared with a handful of trusted figures, and yet the ambush had been perfectly timed. That meant someone inside their own ranks had leaked the information. Steele kept his suspicions to himself, but the seed of distrust had been planted. Weeks turned into months, and no trace of Hound was ever found. The stolen cargo resurfaced in fragments. Some of the weapons turned up in the hands of a gang in Glasgow, while part of the drug shipment was seized in France during an unrelated bust. This confirmed what Steele already feared. Their enemies were dismantling the shipment and selling it off piece by piece to avoid detection. The disappearance of Ethan Hound Caro marked the first serious fracture in the alliance. It proved that even the most secure operations could be breached, and it forced Steele and Crow to question everyone around them. In a network built on fear, suspicion was the most dangerous weapon of all, and now it was aimed inward. By 2012, the smooth, calculated machine that Callum Steele, Morven and Declan Crow Kavanagh had built was starting to grind under the weight of distrust. The disappearance of Ethan Hound Caro still hung over the network like a shadow, and though neither leader spoke openly about it, both suspected the other might have had a hand in it. Into that tension stepped Sasha Vexley, the London-based financial controller who had been quietly moving their profits into offshore accounts for years. Sasha had always played both sides of the fence. She was sharp, ambitious, and utterly self-serving, and while she kept the network's finances in pristine order on paper, she was quietly siphoning small amounts into accounts only she could access. For years, it went unnoticed. Her thefts were buried within layers of shell companies, false invoices, and forged tax records. But in early 2012, she got bolder, moving larger sums and concealing them with complex cross-border transfers. It was risky, but Sasha believed she was too valuable to ever be suspected. Steele eventually began to notice discrepancies in the flow of funds. Certain accounts were receiving far less than they should, and cash reserves that had always been consistent were showing gaps. He brought it up to Imelda Roche, who, after her own digging, confirmed that the missing amounts were too significant to be accounting errors. Steele didn't tell Crow immediately. His plan was to confront Sasha privately, recover the money, and decide her fate without Dublin's interference. But before he could act, the network was hit with a devastating blow. One of their largest weapon stockpiles, hidden in a Dublin warehouse under the guise of a shipping repair business, was obliterated in a massive explosion. The fire was so intense it melted steel beams and lit up the night sky for miles. Inside were millions in military-grade arms meant for distribution across Ireland and the UK. Among the dead was Crow's younger brother, a trusted enforcer who had been guarding the stockpile. Crow's grief was quickly consumed by rage. To him, this wasn't just an attack. It was a personal insult, a declaration of war. Without waiting for solid proof, he accused Steele of orchestrating the hit to weaken Dublin's control and take over the Irish end of the business. His logic was simple. The timing of the explosion, just as Steele was uncovering financial issues, was too convenient to be coincidence. The fragile trust between them shattered overnight. Crowe mobilized his men, sending armed patrols through Dublin's underworld and targeting any London-linked operators they could find. Businesses with suspected ties to Steele were torched, their owners beaten or driven out of the city. In retaliation, Steele unleashed his own crews in London to cut off Dublin's supply lines. Ports that had once moved goods seamlessly were now swarming with silent watchers, making it impossible for shipments to pass unnoticed. As the violence escalated, Dublin became a city under siege. Drive-by shootings erupted on quiet streets, grenade attacks rattled residential neighborhoods, and gang funerals became a near-weekly occurrence. The Blood Agreement, once the cornerstone of their power, was now little more than a memory. Imelda Roach, who had built the smuggling routes that kept both sides rich, found herself caught in the middle. She tried to mediate, arranging secret meetings between Steele and Crowe in neutral locations. But the talks went nowhere. Every conversation devolved into accusations, with neither man willing to admit fault or back down. Sasha Vexley, sensing the alliance was on the verge of collapse, quietly prepared her escape, moving the last of her stolen funds into a secure account in Gibraltar. The police, who had spent years trying to penetrate the alliance, saw the chaos as an opportunity. Surveillance operations intensified, wiretaps were approved, and undercover officers moved in on the fringes of both networks. But the war between Steele and Crowe was moving faster than law enforcement could keep up. In a matter of months, what had been a tightly controlled empire turned into an uncontrolled inferno, with each side striking harder and more recklessly than the last. The Dublin Inferno, as it would later be called in the press, marked the beginning of the end. What neither Steele nor Crowe realized was that the greatest danger wasn't the enemy across the sea. It was the slow, methodical dismantling of their empire by people they had once trusted completely. By 2015, the war between Callum, Steele, Morven and Declan, Crowe, Kavanagh had drained both sides of the empire they once ruled. Profits that had once flowed like a river were now trickles, eaten away by constant retaliation, lost shipments, and the cost of keeping armed men on every street corner. The smuggling routes that had been invisible for over a decade were now littered with risks, with every port, dock, and ferry crossing under the eye of police task forces. In the middle of this collapse, neither Steele nor Crowe realized that their downfall was already in motion, orchestrated by forces working quietly in the background. It began with a single man, an undercover operative planted by a joint British-Irish task force. For months, he worked his way into Steele's London crew, first as a low-level runner, then as a trusted driver. He listened, observed, and memorized every name, location, and procedure. Steele, distracted by his feud with Crowe and the disappearance of Sasha Vexley with millions in stolen funds, never noticed the threat standing right beside him. The operative was patient, waiting until he could map not just London's side of the operation, but the routes leading into Dublin as well. By the summer of that year, he had everything the authorities needed: hidden stash houses, warehouse blueprints, offshore account details, and even the names of corrupt officials who had shielded the network for years. The task force didn't want to just wound the empire, they wanted to wipe it out in one decisive strike. The takedown happened on a rainy October morning. Across London, armed officers stormed warehouses, storage units, and luxury apartments. In Dublin, heavily armed Garda raided safe houses and dockside offices simultaneously. Over 30 arrests were made in less than 24 hours. Steele's key lieutenants were taken without warning, caught before they could destroy records or make calls. In Spain, Sasha Vexley, who had been living under a false name in Marbella, was cornered in a rented villa. She was arrested before she could transfer the last of her funds to an untraceable account. For the first time in years, the ports ran silent. There were no secret compartments moving across the Irish Sea. No nighttime truck runs under cover of fog. The network that had once seemed untouchable was crumbling in real time. But the most shocking twist came when police announced they had evidence linking Crow to the explosion that killed his own brother 3 years earlier. According to intercepted communications, the warehouse blast had been a miscalculated internal hit aimed at removing a rival within Dublin's ranks, but the device had detonated earlier than planned. Crow had allegedly covered it up by blaming Steele, igniting the war that destroyed them both. Whether the evidence was real or planted to divide what remained of their crews, it hit Steele like a blade to the spine. And yet, when the raids ended, Steele himself was nowhere to be found. Witnesses claimed he'd been seen slipping into a black SUV hours before the arrests began. Others swore he had boarded a cargo ship bound for South America weeks earlier. Anticipating the crackdown, theories spread like wildfire. Some believed he had retired under a new identity in Argentina or Brazil, living quietly on hidden fortunes. Others whispered darker rumors, saying Crow had finally caught up with him, burying him in an unmarked grave somewhere outside Dublin. Crow didn't last much longer. Within a year, he too had vanished. Some said he was hiding in rural Spain under the protection of an old ally, while others believed he had been killed by his own men after refusing to share the last of the profits. Whatever the truth, neither man was ever seen again. The routes they built, however, didn't die with them. New names began to control the flow. Smaller, leaner crews who had learned from the mistakes of Steele and Crow. The violence quieted, but the infrastructure remained, passed on like a dark inheritance to the next generation of criminals. Ports, warehouses, and shipping lanes still carried more than legitimate goods, only now the faces had changed. For the police, the case was hailed as a major victory, but in the underworld, it was seen differently. Steele and Crow had proved that two cities separated by sea could be bound together in blood and business, and that lesson was not forgotten. Even years later, whispers of their empire still echoed in dockside bars and backroom gambling dens. Reminders of the time when London and Dublin's most feared men ruled the shadows from coast to coast.